is before you. One by one we will take you.
Wow. Top 5.
Top 5.
Actually, it's a top 10 because there are two of us, and you do sci-fi and I do horror. And we have bitten
10.
off a little bit of a chunk of history to chew on.
Well, that was my first comment was, okay, we're doing a top 5. Let's keep it short. Let's keep it simple. Tim, you picked the 1950s. Why did we do that?
Well, I did it for a reason, because when you go to an individual year in that decade, there's not a lot to choose from. So if you go to the entire decade, it's easier to come up with a top 5.
Well, says you. This is the 1950s, and it's science fiction. So I have, 17 honorable mentions. And no, I do have some honorable mentions, but my original list was like 30 freaking movies.
I have a bunch too, but yeah. I had to turn a lot of mine down to context and honorable mentions as well.
Yeah,
I mean,
I did this.
The 50s alone was a decade that had fantastic movies.
Yes.
I have in my notes, The Searchers came out, John Ford, Roman Holiday, Rear Window, On the Waterfront, Some Like It Hot, Rebel Without a Cause, Singing in the Rain, Sunset Boulevard. I mean, lots of big movies came out in the 50s.
Yes.
But on the horror side, some terrible stuff was going on. All the Universal classic actors like Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. were having trouble finding work. Thus, these movies were out there. Bride of the Gorilla. Bela Lugosi meets a Brooklyn gorilla. Just really terrible horror movies like The Black Castle, The Strange Door, The Black Sheep, Voodoo Island, The Cyclops, The Haunted Stranger, The Alligator People. I mean, none of these were good movies, and a lot of them starred those stars of the prior decade.
Well, it's interesting. When I was doing the sci-fi research, start of the decade, awesome, incredible, such great movies. By the end of the decade, sci-fi had devolved into just schlock. It was monster movies,
Crab Monster,
and bizarre stuff in the end of the decade. And I was like, oh, why did you guys go there? I mean, still had some interesting ones in the latter part of the decade, but the beginning of the decade was much better for classic science fiction. Yes.
Yeah, we've covered some of those classic sci-fis. Actually, we've covered some of these horrors as well on the podcast.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, as a matter of fact, I was going to ask you, once it's over, you can tell me, but I think that every one of my top 5s we've already covered.
Oh.
I think so. I'm pretty sure we have.
I'm not sure about mine. Oh, actually, we've covered 4 of them.
So, yeah.
No, I'm wrong. We've covered all of them. We have covered all of them, but one of them hasn't aired yet.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, do we want to start and jump in?
I think that's great. I have a feeling that your sci-fi will probably be a better film than my horror, since the 1950s were the decade of sci-fi. So I could go first if you like.
Sure.
My number 5 is a little movie called House of Wax.
Ooh.
This movie came out in 1953. It was the first horror movie that is, with Vincent Price in it. Vincent Price came along after that movie to become a horror movie star. But this is kind of the one that put him on the map. We covered it on the podcast, I think, before we were doing video. It was directed by someone, I'm not even sure of his name. I think it's French. And it's the classic story, of a wax museum where a man that's running it is insane and decides he's going to get the real likeness of people by covering them in wax.
Of course.
Hot wax. And you find out later, of course, that he's deformed and that his face is actually a mask and it gets cracked off. Anyway, not the greatest horror movie of all, but I would definitely say it's an influential horror movie, and that's why I have it up in my top 5.
Very much so. And I think I remember enjoying when we did it. I liked the way it was done. Very theatrical, great music, that sort of thing. My number 5 is based on a Jules Verne classic. It's 1954, Richard Fleischer, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Great science fiction, incredible design, good acting. If you kind of look over the two principal leads, because they kind of do it in a 50s style, but they're still good. And it's one of the most influential books and movies, I think, for me growing up. It turned me on to science fiction, and science fiction didn't have to be in outer space. It could be under the water, and it's just a futuristic tale. And I've always loved that design. The Nautilus design is amazing. So there you go.
Yeah, they're dead. They're all messed up.
Okay. Well, I'm moving on to my number 4, and I've just forgot to preface all this with, you're going to disagree with some of my picks. I know you are. But you won't disagree with this one. This one could potentially fall under science fiction. I think we covered it as a horror movie. I can't really remember. 1954's Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Yep.
Directed by Jack Arnold, who did other movies that we've covered, science fiction movies, I believe. We just did one, didn't we?
Yeah, The Incredible Shrinking Man, Jack Arnold.
Incredible Shrinking Man. Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm. Creature from the Black Lagoon, classic, toward the end, I guess you would say, of the Universal movie monsters. And it was such a Universal movie monster makeup job that we don't even really know who. Well, we know it was a swimmer that played him. I can't remember his name, but he wasn't a famous actor like Boris Karloff or Bela Lugosi. And Creature was just one of those unique movies because it had a lot of underwater filming. It spawned 2 sequels, and I don't know. I don't know what else to say about it. It's just fantastic.
Both sequels came out in the 50s too, right?
I think so. I'm pretty sure, because I want to say by the time the third one came out, it was like a drive-in kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I would definitely agree. It was on my initial list, of course, because I think it does fall into that category of, could be horror, could be science fiction, both kind of thing. My number 4 is similar to that. It could fall into either. We've already covered it on the podcast. It's one of my favorite bug-eyed monster movies called Them. Excellent giant ants, radioactively grown in the desert, start attacking. It's awesome. It's 1954, so middle of the decade. Directed by Gordon Douglas. Like we said, we've covered it on the podcast. If you guys want to go back and watch our episode, it's really good. I've always liked
that. Was
this
a
movie.
Fun one, actually.
Yeah, and like we said, it does cover both. Can it be considered a monster movie? Of course, it's giant monsters. But also science fiction is incredibly important to the storytelling of it. That this is that nuclear fear and what's going to happen if we drop more bombs and do more tests in the desert. Look what's happening.
That's the one where James Arness and Stuart Whitman are like authorities in every state of the United States on these monsters taking over, and they're always running around.
In every uniform.
Every weapon they can fight. I mean, it's hilarious.
They are perfect. Yes.
And the little girl, of course. Them. My number 3 is going to be a little controversial choice, but I chose Night of the Demon. Actually, that's the British title. Curse of the Demon is the American title. Look at David's face. I knew he was going to go there. Night of the Demon, or should I say, I'm going to say Curse of the Demon because that's the American title.
What is
directed by Jacques Tourneur. Jacques Tourneur. It is classic in many ways. It is beautifully shot. It has Dana Andrews in it, who I like. I think he's a good actor. Look at you. Go away.
Do whatever. Go for you.
One of the reasons I chose it is the first movie about Satanism that I can recall. It predates Hammer as far as that's concerned. Yes. Satanism and devil worship became popular in the Hammer movies, if I'm not mistaken. That was the first place I ever saw it. I'm sure there are, demon movies that precede this, but this is the first well-known one. and it is highly rated with critics. I have a Criterion DVD of it. The reason David doesn't like it is there is a big giant monster in it that is sort of almost a statue of a demon that comes at you. And Jacques Turner vetoed that. He filmed it without that. He left everything up to your imagination. The studio added the monster post. So he really was not responsible for that. And I like this movie. So Curse of the Demon is my number 3.
My number 5 was Jules Verne. Now I'm going to H.G. Wells, 1953, directed by Byron Haskin, a classic. And when people say 50s science fiction, this comes to mind, War of the Worlds.
Wow.
And brilliant, incredible adaptation, I think, of it. Is it the novel? No. Is it Orson Welles' version? No. They do take some liberties with the story, with the characters, but the basic gist is there: Martian invasion of the Earth, these incredible machines that are unstoppable, and no matter what we do, we can't do it. We look at utter defeat in the face, and they die because of a bacteria that gets a virus that they can't control.
I'm surprised that's not your number 1.
My top 3, I could alternate. All 3 of the top 3. I could go, okay, which day is it this week? I like this one best. But, but I my number 1 when we get there. You'll know it.
War of the Worlds is way up there with me, too. If we were doing sci-fi horror, it'd be on my list, probably.
Always. Yeah. That's my number 3.
Why are you torturing me like this?
My number 2 is a movie called Dracula.
Ooh.
But actually, the American title is Horror of Dracula, because it is the Hammer version in 1958 that starred Christopher Lee as Dracula, Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. It also had Michael Gough in it, and is directed by Terence Fisher, who we've covered numerous times on the podcast as well. You can't go wrong with Hammer. It's not their first horror movie. It was preceded 1 year by The Curse of Frankenstein, but it is the second gathering of those two actors. Go ahead.
And I think it's one of their best. It may not be their first, but it's definitely one of their best.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's the one where Peter Cushing as Van Helsing is like running around like an action hero, jumping on tables and staking vampires. It's great.
Ripping curtains down.
Ripping curtains down, yes.
Isn't it the same one where he does the 2 candlesticks to make the
It
cross?
is. And it's also the one where Christopher Lee comes down those stairs so fast in that long cape, it almost looks like he's floating down them.
Yeah. That's a good one.
And it's bright colors, bright blood, buxom women. I mean, it's just, they took the Dracula from 1931 and just amped it up to the max and came out with this new version. And it is my number 2.
Excellent. My number 2 is not only one of the best science fiction movies of the 50s, it is one of the best science fiction movies ever, like in the past 70 years. And it led to the creation of the series that we cover in our other podcast. It's 1956, directed by Fred Wilcox, Forbidden Planet.
Yeah.
A classic science fiction. I mean, this set up Star Trek so well. It set up so many science fiction movies after that took place aboard spaceships. Just the way they did the camaraderie of the crew, the way they told the story, the special effects, using a theremin as the music. It's really a great movie to watch. Again, the story is great, almost Shakespearean, based loosely on The Tempest, or inspired by The Tempest, probably. And we've covered it on the podcast already.
Yeah. So, like you said, I think we've covered all of these on the podcast. Well, that brings me to my number 1, another controversial choice, because it could also be classified as science fiction, but this is what I chose, and it is Godzilla. 1954, the big guy, Godzilla, not Godzilla King of the Monsters, the American version from 1956, but the original uncut Japanese version that we really weren't able to see until, I think, the 21st century. I don't think it was released over here until within the last 20 years, maybe. It was hard to find the original Japanese version for a long time.
I think it was Criterion that did the restoration, and once they did
I think so
that,
too.
we could get it. Yeah,
You can always watch the American recut with Raymond Burr, but it's bad and terribly narrated. It's like a movie with a lot of narration because they don't want to show you Japanese subtitles. Yep. The original was directed by Ishiro Honda with a screenplay by Takeo Murata. Lots of environmental undertones, but also lots of subtext that is deeply sad and dark because of what, Nagasaki and Hiroshima went through when they were, bombed by us in the 40s. And so, this idea was birthed that, maybe a prehistoric creature could come out of the ocean because of a hydrogen bomb testing. And in this movie, Godzilla is not a caricature of himself yet. He is just a monster that comes up and wreaks havoc in Tokyo, as well as surrounding islands and sinking ships. Its influence, it's an icon. It's got to be the most influential film of the 1950s as far as sequels, that's for sure, because it had more than 35 of them. And I just couldn't think of a more highly rated horror movie than that.
I think 50s. if you think monsters in the 50s, you've got to think Godzilla. It is what it is, sort of thing. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that's a great top choice. My number one, 1951, directed by one of your favorites, Robert Weiss, and probably my favorite, I've stated several times, my favorite science fiction movie of all time, The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Oh, yeah.
It's the story, the message, the acting, Michael Rennie, the direction, all the way through it is just an incredible story of an alien invasion that has a message to it. They have the Gort threat, of course, and everything else, but it is overall the story of, hey, get your stuff together. You guys could be a really good planet if you weren't killing each other all the time, and either get over it or we'll have to not let you play in space with us, kind of thing. And I love the message of it. I could watch this movie over and over and over again. It's one of my favorite science fiction movies of all time.
I don't know if you realized it, but you just mentioned a movie and I mentioned a movie that are both from the science fiction song, A Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Yeah.
Because you have Michael Rennie and I have Dana Andrews.
Yep.
Oh, how funny. Well, that brings us to some honorable mention. We usually do 3 of these. I have 3, but I actually have 6 because I paired them up because of, you'll see why.
Okay.
My first honorable mentions are The House on Haunted Hill and The Tingler.
Ooh, yep.
Those are both William Castle movies, and Castle was big in the 1950s, especially for what we were talking about as far as like drive-in horror. I picked 2 Hammer movies for number 2, The Curse of Frankenstein and The Mummy. Both of those came out in the 50s. However, I think Dracula is better, which is why I chose it for the list.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, sci-fi horror, which I've already mentioned. There was a lot of crossover in the 50s. I picked 2 of those, and they would be Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Fly. So
those are great ones.
Those are my honorable mentions.
My honorable mention number 3 is The Thing from Another World, 1951, Kristen Nyby. It was we've covered it, of course, in the podcast, and it was so influential with what it did. So,
we covered the remake, but we do talk a lot about the original.
During that. Yeah. As a matter of fact, it's one of our first episodes. And my second, another very influential science fiction film of the 50s. Again, when you think of the 50s and you see the posters and everything else, this one was there mostly because of the poster, but also because of the story. This Island Earth. Jack Arnold again. 1955, the Metalunans are attempting to save their own planet by recruiting scientists from Earth. Really cool story. Kind of a good pairing with War of the Worlds, honestly. It's kind of an interesting sort of look at what an invasion would be like in both different ways. One's kind of surreptitious, the other one's, overtly military. And my number 1 is the same as yours, 1958, Kurt Newman, The Fly. But mostly because this movie still scares me.
It's a horror movie. I mean, it really is.
It really is. But science is it's the transporter. I mean, that's what it is, and so sci-fi is a crucial element to the storytelling, but it is scary. And that spider and the help me at the end still gets me every time.
After we do our honorable mentions, I usually like to mention other movies that were out that decade for context.
Mm-hmm.
And I have grouped these as well as grouping my honorable mentions.
Okay.
For context, I've got a category called Not Really Horror, and those are The Hound of the Baskervilles, which I actually watched. It's very good.
It is good.
Diabolique, which is a French film I have not seen, but I think that's more of a thriller. Then I also have kid movies, bad kid movies like The Bad Seed. I recently rewatched that. I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, and I Was a Teenage Werewolf. Both came out in the 50s. Other schlocky kind of drive-in movies. Lots of
There was
sequels.
another one of those that I keep saying we need to cover or put on our list or do eventually, and it's called Teenagers from Outer Space. And it was the same era and everything else. And I really like it. I think it's a cool little horror science fiction.
If I'm not mistaken, that's public domain. I think I've used some artwork from that before. Yeah, because it's kind of funny. And you know what? I don't think I have it. Do I have Village of the Damned on here? I do. I have a lot on here. But I don't Village. No, you know why? Because it came out in 1960. That's why.
60.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. All right. Sequels. The Son of Dr. Jekyll. Revenge of the Creature Walks Among Us, the daughter of Dr. Jekyll, Frankenstein's Daughter, The Revenge of Frankenstein, and Return of the Fly all came out in the 50s.
We want those franchises.
Oh, my God. Comedies, Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which actually has Boris Karloff in it.
Yep.
Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, A Bucket of Blood, which was, I believe, Roger Corman with Dick Miller, if I'm not mistaken. Ed Wood movies came out in the 1950s. Bride of the Monster, Plan 9 from Outer Space, Night of the Ghouls. And then lastly, I have sci-fi hybrids, and that list is long.
Sure.
You've mentioned some of these. The Thing from Another World, Invaders from Mars, It Came from Outer Space, Robot Monster, which was really just a gorilla with a space helmet on, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Them, Tarantula, Rodan, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I think I had that in my honorable mentions. I did. Yeah, I watched that again recently. Love that movie.
20 Million Miles to Earth, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, all that.
Yes, The Monolith Monsters, which is one that you mentioned. The Incredible Shrinking Man, which I'm surprised you didn't mention.
It was on my cold list, but it's definitely up there. Yep.
Black Scorpion, The Fly, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, The Blob, which we have covered on the podcast, and I Married a Monster from Outer Space, which we have covered on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Lots to choose from.
It was a great decade to pick, though. I mean, overall, just because it got me thinking about so many movies, that came out in that era.
And putting them in that timeline, because sometimes they kind of blur between the 40s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is what we think are the top 5 horror and top 5 sci-fi movies of the 1950s. We want to know what you guys out there think. Let us know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, please subscribe. If you like what you see here, we've got a lot more. You can check out our regular show, Johnny Has the Keys, where we go in depth about a single movie once a week, 40 weeks a year. And we also have some Patreon shows. If you're into Star Trek, the original series, or the X-Files, we have some subscription and bonus content over there. It's not all subscription. And I guess until next time, I'll be seeing you, David.
I'll see you then.
All righty. Bye.
Bye.
You can't start the car. Johnny has the keys.